Greetings, my fellow peasants. I'm going to go on a rant today. Last weekend, I paid the property tax on my house. It had gone up 20% from the previous year, despite my efforts to contest the assessment with the county assessor's office. To make matters worse, the new tax law will make it so that I no longer have a federal tax deduction for the thousands of dollars that I pay in property tax. It got me to thinking. About a decade ago, I cast off what I considered to be my landlord at the time by paying off my 6.25% mortgage. Despite paying for my house and having no debt secured against it, I still don't own my property. I still have a lord of the manor who extracts from me a sum equivalent to 2% of the assessed value of my house each and every year. 2% might not seem like much, but over the course of 50 years, it will mean that I've paid as much money to the county and state in taxes as I paid to the person who sold me the house. So it seems whether a person rents or owns, mortgage or not, a person cannot escape having a landlord, or should I say, lord of the land. According to the statistics, the average property tax paid in my state is about $7,000 per year. That's roughly equivalent to 480 ounces of silver at current spot silver prices. An article I found on taxation in medieval times said that at the height of taxation in the 1300s, when Sweden was occupied by German knights, the average peasant had to pay between 168 and 227 grams of silver in taxes, which is about 5 to 7 ounces of silver. The article also says that this was the equivalent of 105 to 162 kilograms of butter. Today, a kilogram of butter costs about $7, or half an ounce of silver. Doing a little simple math suggests that silver had about 10 times the purchasing power back then that it does now, at least in terms of butter. Still, it seems the peasants back then paid much less in real estate taxes than the modern-day peasants living in my state. This isn't to imply that medieval peasants live a better life than we do now. Modern-day peasants live in houses the size of some castle outpost back then, and they have transportation that any medieval knight would envy. Though the medieval peasant never had to endure listening to modern pop music while sitting in a dentist chair, which is a torture far more severe than any inflicted during the Spanish Inquisition. Property tax was not the only way that feudal lords lived off of the productivity of the peasant class. They also controlled the money. Seigniorage was a common practice whereby the king could keep a portion of the gold and silver brought in for minting. It was also common practice to provide coin that was debased through the addition of inferior metal. Both practices allowed the king to keep a portion of the monetary metal that circulated in the kingdom. In modern times, our overlords can achieve the same thing with paper and digital money. There is nothing to debase. All the ruling class needs to do is spend more than they tax. The difference becomes new currency, which essentially devalues the currency already in the hands of the peasants. The devious part of this practice is that this process is much more difficult for the modern-day peasants to understand. As a result, there are fewer instances in modern history of modern feudal lords having their heads severed from their bodies by a discontented army of serfs. Maybe we're overdue for such an event. Who knows? But as much as the currency is debauched, it doesn't have a tendency to suddenly drop to zero value, at least not in world power countries. And why is that? It's because the modern-day feudal lord has figured out that so long as the serfs are amply taxed and that they have crushing debt burdens, there will always be a demand for the currency. If the modern-day peasants can't produce enough money to pay their tribute to the lords and lenders, then they will be kicked off of their land and have their possessions taken. There are plenty of taxes that need to be paid. There is the property tax, which we've already discussed. Then there is sales tax, on the items that modern-day serfs need to buy. In my own neck of the woods, this is about 9% of the price of the items. Then there is the income tax. Do you want to work so that you can support yourself and your family? Well, that's going to cost you. Both the state lords and the feudal lords oops, I meant federal lords, will take what they consider to be fair. I personally pay more than 1/3 of every additional feudal reserve note that I earn to my feudal masters. Whoops, there I go again. I meant to say that I personally pay more than 1/3 of every additional federal reserve note that I earn to my federal masters. Want to drive a car? Well, you're going to need to pay your registration fee and license fee to the overlords at the DMV. Also, have you ever noticed that a significant portion of the price of gasoline is tax? In my county, the tax on gasoline is in excess of the profit that the oil refiner makes from the process of producing the gasoline itself. Ever look at your phone, your electric, heating, or cable bill? Take a good look and see how much money is extracted in the form of taxes and fees. I'd really encourage you to do this next time you get a bill. Have anything left in value at the end of your life? Well, they'll tax your peasant corpse too. Of course, our feudal lords of modern times don't just include the political class. They contain two other groups of people as well. First, there's the banker, who in modern times can lend out money that doesn't even exist and collect interest on it. I don't think even the great sorcerer Merlin could accomplish such a feat. How much interest does the average American pay each year? I read recently that a typical person will pay $5,600 in mortgage interest, $1,000 in auto loan interest, $900 in credit card interest, and $650 in student loan interest. And this is at a time when the interest rates are at historic lows. Add all of this up, and it works out to be just about 1/10 of what the typical household earns before taxes. It seems that our modern-day banking overlord does pretty well from lending out what isn't his in the first place. But what happens when the modern-day banking overlord gets too greedy and engages in subprime lending practices to those who can't possibly repay? That's where it helps to have alliances. If the banking kings run into trouble, then they just talk to the political kings, who will then bail out the banking lords via promises of future taxes to be paid by the serfs, who can pay their debts. The other class of modern overlord consists of corporate executives. We typically think of the CEOs, but we forget about all of the other executives. There are chief operating officers, or COOs, chief financial officers, or CFOs, chief technology officers, or CTOs, chief information officers, or CIOs, and the list goes on. In addition, there are countless other executives, from regional VPs to department directors, each deriving a significant portion of their pay from stock incentive and stock option plans. Now, I don't want to give away too much of my own background, but I am intimately familiar with how these stock incentive and stock option programs work. And let me tell you, if you are contributing to your 401k plan and buying a stock index fund like a good obedient peasant, you are getting royally shafted. You may not feel it right now due to elevated stock market values, but believe me, you'll be feeling it later when the curtain rises and reveals the great Oz. Here's how it works in a nutshell. A corporate executive every year will be granted a certain amount of stock options. Usually the total number of options is quite large. Each option gives the owner the right to buy a share at a fixed price, usually the market price on the day that the option is issued. Now imagine an executive getting thousands and thousands of options that don't expire for 10 years. If the stock price doubles within that period of time, then the executive can exercise the option at market, pay for the shares with half of the proceeds, and keep the other half. This happens at no cost to the executive, but severely dilutes the number of shares that are available on the market and held by the good little 401k peasants. Now, according to the Economic Policy Institute, the typical CEO of the 350 largest firms in the U.S. receives compensation of $19 million a year, mostly in the form of stock options. For those who are interested, this is 253 times the average household income in the U.S. And you, the 401k stock index serf, are paying for it. And don't forget, our CEO king has a full court of nobility that is also getting richly compensated. We have the C-suite dukes, the regional VP counts, and the corporate director barons, who all share in the spoils of the tribute provided by the 401k peasant. Now, why do you think stock prices are so high right now? Well, a lot of it has to do with the incentives of the corporate executive. If a large portion of compensation comes in the form of stock option incentives, do you think that the executive is going to want to spend significant amounts of money on dividend payments or capital investment on new growth projects? No! The executive is going to borrow as much money as possible and buy shares in the open market to get the stock price as high as possible. Oh, and by the way, if you are balancing out your 401k with some bond funds, like a nice compliant serf should, then you are providing the funds necessary for these stock buybacks. Again, you might not believe me now, because everything is rosy on Wall Street, but this really is what's happening. All of the dirty laundry will eventually be aired. By the way, the incentives of the corporate monarchy also inspire CEOs to move as much production to foreign lands as possible to take advantage of lesser serfs who are willing to work 14-hour days, 7 days a week, in horrible conditions just to feed their families. This is leading to a loss of higher-paying jobs than the U.S. vassals used to enjoy. But hey, that's what capitalism is all about, right? If I'm giving you the impression that we're living in a giant machine that enriches a modern-day nobility class at the expense of the rest of us, then I've accomplished what I've meant to accomplish with this video. But there is one thing left to discuss, and that is how we can deconstruct this kind of system. Long past is the day of revolution with pitchforks and torches. I do sense that violent revolution may be on the horizon, but there has to be a better way. My idea is to withdraw support for the system. Start by living simply. A simple life involves low expenses. Low expenses makes it possible to live a debt-free life. Living a debt-free life will starve the banking nobles by cutting off their interest payments, much the same way as a castle siege of old cut off the nobility from their source of food. Living a simple life also makes it possible to live comfortably on a smaller salary, or for fewer working years, which reduces income tax payments to the feudal, federal nobility. Living simply also means living in a smaller house, which will reduce property taxes. But living simply is not enough. Today's system of feudal nobility is of a fascist variety. That means that the king is not the politician or the banker. The king is the corporate executive. These are the people who lobby Congress and have PACs. These are the people who determine where the jobs will be located and what the pay will be. These are the people who are making 253 times in a year what the average household earns. A revolution against the king is really a revolution against the corporate executive. But what does that mean? First, a siege against the king's castle involves cutting off the main source of executive pay, the stock option payout. As I said, the CEO obtains this pay from you, the buyer of stocks and bonds. When masses of people buy stock, it pushes up stock prices, allowing the executive to exercise options at a great profit. Those who are providing the funds in this manner really only pay for it when the markets go back down, which they always do. When masses of people buy bonds, it provides the corporation funds needed to buy back shares, which also elevates stock prices and allows the corporate nobility to cash out. And those who provide the funds in this manner really only pay for it when the over-indebted corporations declare bankruptcy, like how Sears is about to do. But if I do this, how will I pay for my future when I'm no longer working, you might ask? I can tell you from personal experience that there is a way. One of the benefits of living a simple life is that it will allow you to save 30 or more % of your after-tax income. If you can do this and save in something that doesn't get debauched, then you only need to work about 2/3 of your adult life. I've shown you the formula in several of my prior videos of how this works. And what is my vehicle of choice for saving? It's mainly gold, with some silver. With a gold and silver store of wealth, there is no continuous property tax, because the county and state nobility aren't aware that you have it. With gold and silver, there is no continuous extraction of wealth from the federal nobility from the process of seigniorage. With gold and silver, there is no extraction of continuous fees from the banking nobility. Best of all, with gold and silver, there is no extraction of wealth from the corporate kings who debauch the shares of the companies that they run through a continuous process of share option awards to themselves and to their courts. Now, I don't know if more than a handful of you will do as I do. It's certainly not going to be something that you're encouraged to do. But then again, is the peasantry always well served by doing what the nobility suggests that they do? I think in medieval times, the practice of the peasantry was to keep some silver well hidden away from the greedy eyes of the nobility. We can probably learn a thing or two from them.